to relate to some of the issues that came up, specifically given the kind of work I've done and things I've been thinking about more related to neuroimaging, that with the focus, though I think some of the issues are I think some of the issues that I will raise were already raised in certain ways by David, by his own work on imaging, and today during the talk looking at the question of task, for example, that we'll visit a little bit. It will be also interesting, I think, to maybe, and that will, I assume we'll have ample time for discussion, to think also of putting together for the people who were here yesterday for the work on theory of mind and the relationship between theory of mind and language and how to investigate these questions. I think I will mention some work on theory of mind of my own, but in imaging, and I think there's an interesting question to ask at the level of how to think, how to address eventually experimentally some of the questions about language, some of the discussion we already started earlier with David. So hopefully that will become a bit clear further on. So this you've already seen, and this is kind of what now will be considered a classic or traditional, old, whatever view of the relation, the way language is implemented or is emerges from neural tissue with this division that was traditionally termed, and David clearly was talking about how that was started to change in the 70s, but a model that was, and in many ways, this is not gone. I think we're still having a strong, there's a lot of work that still has this input-output, so production, comprehension, underlying the either explicitly in the model, like certain production models and so forth, or implicitly in some of the assumptions that go into interpretation of data, and how these changed starting from the 70s, but in a sense, in a way that reflects, I think, a standard view, at least in the kind of linguistics in generative linguistics and otherwise, where we are not distinguishing production from comprehension, but when we think of grammar, when we think of the linguistic, so if you make the step to go from grammar as a cognitive or abstract object to think of grammar in the brain, one way you can go about it is to assume that also in the brain you will not find this distinct, that you will not look for a production system and a comprehension system, but you look to it, when you look for grammar, you look for this thing that actually is non-directional, which is kind of underlies both. And again, this is not a trivial assumption, as this model shows. It was actually thought to almost be like separate. This has been changing, and I will come back a little bit about these changes in a moment. Here I added a slide that I'm totally jumping elsewhere. That this is a study, and a second one coming right after, that came to my mind yesterday here in Stephanie's work actually, and the mentioning of the work on aphasia and theory of mind. And actually this also resonates a lot with the work earlier today from David. So in fact, I will be saying things that already David said much better than me, but I just add that because I just think it's really interesting to think about these issues. I'll explain in a moment what these slides are about, and it brings in issues of cross modality, cross modularity, cross domain issues, which I think are very interesting to think. So this is work that was, I think, at least at the time, was, I think, we're getting a lot of attention. This paper by Spelke and Dan and Kathy Lemmer, etc. You see the authors, and they, as you might know or not, that these people have been highly invested in issues of number representation and mathematical abilities. Stanislav Dan has books, and a book, or make books, and a lot of work. And this is work they did with patients. So they had two patients. I hope you can see on the right, in the bottom there, the patient on the bottom with, I think, parietal damage, and the patient that will interest us particularly is the BRI, who has this massive left hemisphere kind of aphasia damage, and that presents, and only that patient out of the two presents, like you've heard this morning, like very, the agrammatism, like aphasia with all the linguistic tests showing that. And what they then do, they have them do mathematical operations. There's a whole set of them. I just gave you one graph on the right, which gives us enough to see the pattern. So this is now error rate. On the left, you see the controls. The middle is the aphasic patient. On the right is the parietal damage patient. And what? He stops working.
I think it might be running out of battery.
Yeah.
Power.
Thank you. And what they found, and that was for them kind of very beautifully sitting within their views of, again, so maybe I should bit of a background, these authors are not the only ones, but Invest also had a lot going into this idea that there is two numerical systems. There's this analog magnitude, innate, species, non-specific, it seems, ability to estimate magnitudes but numerical magnitudes, specific, not only numerical magnitude, but also numerical magnitude. And there's this also species-specific, it seems, ability to count and do things like exact addition, multiplication, etc. Mathematics as we think of it in school, and using like verbal code. And for them, those were systems that were interacting in an interesting way, but also separate. And those patients show exactly that distinction. So the aphasic patient in the middle was having you can see a lot of errors exactly with the exact calculations, but much less errors with approximate. And on the contrary, the parietal patient in the region that assume interparietal sulcus, where we assume they are proposing for many reasons that's where the magnitude estimation system is built in. Does not show any error with the exact, but does show error with the approximation. So that was like, wow, we have this amazing ability, and that's like we can show now that we have like competence. Like here's the linguistic competence. Someone with aphasia really, they don't have language anymore, and also they don't have exact math. And that's okay. Wow. But then comes this paper. I think just the same year, or this other paper, PNAS. I mean, it was definitely got. I don't know how much attention it got, but at the time I think it should have got a bit more. But what they found, they had 3 patients, all of them with clear left hemisphere lesions. You can see the scans on the right, and all of them presenting severe aphasia with all the tests we've seen, like non-canonical sentences, reversible. All those tests, they showed the pattern of agrammatism, but they had no problem with doing mathematics, so they actually were doing really well on the math. And the reason I'm showing it here now is there was one important difference between these two experiments. The first, the ones we saw earlier, this one, all the calculations were done without paper and pen. They were done orally, verbally, whatever you call it, like just, I don't know what's the term in English for that. Okay, so they were not actually using anything to calculate, while here they actually had a paper and pen, and they could use paper and pen. And so then that goes, I think, to the heart also of some of the issues that David was saying today. So if we assume, of course, those are not the same patients, not the same lesions, but if we just for the sake of argument assume that those are the same lesions, or if we could have gone back to this patient and retest that patient handwriting and find out that then she can all of a sudden multiply and subtract and do all the things that she seems that she cannot do, or he, I think it's a she, but she cannot do verbally, then at what level do we want to situate the problem? Do we want to say that by not, at the mathematical level, but then we can also question what does it mean, and that's exactly 2 points of David today, is like when you have aphasia and it seems that you cannot produce sentences, at what level are we claiming that the deficit is? It could be different for every patient. Is it really you cannot do any more merge or whatever allows you to create numerical, if you're taking Chomsky as Chomsky's idea of mathematics, that you don't have anymore the ability to combine units to create numbers or sentences, or is it just a certain additional ability that allows you to externalize these operations. And the same goes for math and for language. And so I just think, it's really, really, when we look at, and I think, again, I just brought that up because I thought it was interesting, and kind of this cross-domain reminded me of yesterday's theory of mind paper that was discussed. But again, David made a point much more strongly this morning already. So let's go forward. So this is basically, so what I think is happening, and I think, again, the work, Andrea really concentrated on Broca's area, but also started mentioning, okay, there's these other regions that start kind of coming to play now with discussing syntactic, the syntactic network. David's work also this morning, while being non-conclusive, and the general picture was kind of a little bit, what's the word, dim? Depressing, yeah? It's still, if we could have looked just at, if we were kind of if we were trying to look at it a bit more positive, it was like, it's interesting. Indeed, it might not be necessarily Broca's area, but interesting to note that there are certain regions that do seem to appear, angular gyrus, certain areas in them, that we are starting to find, more or less regularly. Nothing, I'm agreeing with David, there's nothing, that nothing is clear, and I think we need our toolbox, I think, needs to maybe radically change, but it seems that other areas are also involved. And I think what changed, so first of all, I think that things are changing, and I think in an interesting direction in the literature. One way of talking about it, I think that there is more openness now to drop, I think, and David, that would be interesting to hear your perspective, really, to drop the necessity for the, so for many years there was this modularity debate. So if there was a language deficit, it was only interesting if there was no other deficit to go with it, because the moment there was another deficit in another domain, you say, okay, then it's not language specific anymore, then we don't care about it, because it doesn't help us to characterize the linguistic, system. And so there was a lot of, and I'll jump right ahead to an example of that. And I think this seems to me to be slightly, maybe the field is getting over that obsession, because again, like I was saying earlier, as a response to David's work, I think whoever this, this creation of that, or whatever, the emergence of that criteria to what is relevant to us to understand the linguistic system as being anything, it had to be language specific, I don't think is the only way you can go around describing the language system, because we can imagine that whatever we think of the languages in production and comprehension might involve language specific things, but also might involve other mechanisms shared with other cognitive activities, or, as Jill was pointing out, it might actually underlie other cognitive domains, and we don't know a priori what is linguistic or what is verbal, what is not verbal, and hence I think we should be more open to consider either deficits or data from other domains, or or comorbidity between a linguistic function and other functions to understand better the linguistic function. And so here is just one case which I find very interesting. So this is work from Paris on Huntington disease. So Huntington disease, if you don't know, is a terrible disease, genetic, where there is a degeneration of starting from the basal ganglia and then spreading into the cortex of the brain, and the person eventually dies, often young, and starts showing symptoms that have to do mainly with motor control, up to a level where it becomes, decapacitating, and other levels as well, and results in death. So what this group did, which working with, so Huntington, to my knowledge, at least when I've never seen Huntington mentioned as a linguistic, as a maybe it is, but maybe it's my ignorance, but as a language related or language pathology. Again, because of the logic that if it's motor, then it has nothing to do with language, because it's motor and it's something else. So what this group did is actually looked at very early stage Huntington. So these people, we already know they have Huntington disease. We have, I guess, the data both from the genetics but also from brain imaging, but they're not even showing yet any serious symptoms motor-wise. And what they did a kind of a priming experiment, going from a sentence to a word. So priming, if you know, I mean, hope you know, everyone knows, is basically a measure of saying how quickly, you know, given what given you as a context, as a prime, how quickly do you process a target? And if the prime is related, you process a target faster. That's basically the idea. And what they used were idioms that because there were idioms, there was a literal meaning of the words and there was the idiomatic meaning. And if you could prime both from the literal meaning and from the idiomatic meaning, so something like in French, Paul a cassé sa pipe, so there is a idiomatic meaning die, but also there is just a meaning of break your pipe, I guess. Whatever. And the English version is just not a translation, it's just an example. So Paul has kicked the bucket, and then you can either prime ball in English, which will be corresponding to kick in the literal sense, or death, which will be related to the... Okay, so we have that. So this is, again, there's an interesting design because this is not a very usual design for, at least to my knowledge, when working with pathology. So it's kind of interesting that there was a bit of a sophisticated design here. What they did then, actually, I didn't mention the design, was that then they looked at the passive version of that. And what happened when it's not really the passive version of that, but it's a passive sentence that looks linearly the same, but doesn't have any more the same meaning and completely doesn't have the idiomatic meaning. So, here. Paul has, where's the passive? Paul est cassé par sa pipe, or Paul was kicked by the bucket. Yeah? So here we still have the literal meaning of the words bucket and pipe, but we don't have anymore the idiomatic meaning. And what they found was two things. First, so on the left controls, on the right Huntington disease. One thing you notice clearly that on the right is much higher than the left. So this is kind of typical, there's nothing really particularly interesting. It just means that overall those patients are just slower than controls. That's not surprising. But what's interesting is that controls behave as we expect. So we find priming in the, and that's the important, is the difference between the left and right. So for idioms, we find priming for both the, so this is, all the way on the left, the darkest one is the unrelated, and then we have the idiom meaning and the non-idiom meaning. So it will be death and bucket. And you see both death and bucket are primed by an idiom, which is what we expect. And then when we passivize it, as we expect again, we find priming for a bucket, because we still get the meaning kick, but no more priming for death. Okay? So that's what we get from the control. And however, for the Huntington, what we get is actually priming is preserved for both cases, independently of the passive. So it's basically just a really, maybe a more subtle way to do exactly what David Kaplan was showing in work that he and many other people did with reversive, with passive, the passive transformation. Basically, it seems that they are not interpreting the passive as a passive, they're just interpreting it linearly as a, and also, so the idiom meaning is preserved because they're not doing the transformation. Yeah? So what it means basically, it took a lot of, it was a lot of time spent to describe this experiment, but the take-home message is that early Huntington disease regions, basal ganglia, not usually part of what we think of as a language area, they cannot do a passive transformation. That, at least in this task. As David would tell us, we should do other tasks, we should ask many things, but at least at the first hand, this is interesting data, telling both coming from a population we're not used to, using an interesting task, and then also telling us something about the region of the brain that now I think has been emerging as a central part of a lot of cognitive processes, but for a long time not considered as a region we should consider in our model. This is a paper I always talk about very positively, and now I can't talk about it because David said it's not good, so I won't talk about it. No, I will just, and now thanks to David's talk, I actually downloaded a number of more recent and see more apparently better done papers that kind of make a similar point, which is that instead of looking at few patients, we're looking at multiple patients. As we saw today, we might get completely results which don't tell us much, or at least tell us that we don't know anything, but it definitely gives us a picture different than the traditional one. And this particular paper I always find interesting because it was, it had its own results, but again, I mean, I think we've looked at more recent and apparently better made studies this morning, and I think that the logic is clear. So this is, so both these people were mentioned this already by Andrea today, Hickok and Popel. This is their model, which you see this model is interesting because it kind of, for me I would say it's an intermediate model. First it integrates regions that were not part of the traditional picture of language. It even integrates the right hemisphere, which is like, usually not talked as part of so you're kind of extending language into the right hemisphere, which seems, interesting, and one can talk more about that. It still has a little bit, the flavor of production perception, but it's definitely, if you look at the way they name their system, there is like the phonological network is now not like for production or for perception. It's actually it's a model, lexical interface the same, combinatorial network the same. So we're starting to look at the network at the model that gets closer to what we've talked earlier. Not anymore talking in terms of perception and production, and starts to be a model where linguists can start identifying things they think of, and so like, oh, okay, so if I work, on this kind of question, or if that's the kind of, contrast I have in the domain I work in, these might be the regions where I'd be interested to kind of investigate, or will make predictions with respect to the kind of activity I'll expect in that. Something that was very hard in earlier models. So this is a model I made during my dissertation, which I never believed in, and I definitely don't believe in now. It has one major advantage over this model. It has many more colors, which I think that it wins. And also, it has, anyway, this, I think, but I might come back to it because some of the results and some of the issues that Andrea brought up, and David might come back with respect to how we interpret activity in these regions, but we'll see. But what I tried to do in my dissertation was to actually try to really map a minimalist-like architecture onto the brain, rather than, to try to really think of what will be the kind of operations a minimalist brain will instantiate in order to produce produce language in the model sense, to have language emerge. So that was just kind of a general idea of like how we might want to try, a suggestion of how we might want to try and think, or how people are starting to think slightly differently maybe than the standard way. I think we still have a long way to go. And now I'll move to talk a bit more about imaging. Andrea talked a lot about it already, so I will skip. I will kind of go a bit fast. There was something I will go. I don't think. Oh wait, maybe it was there. Sorry. No. So I want to say something because for people who are not familiar with imaging, I think it's important to realize some things. I'm especially saying it because people here might not ever do an imaging experiment. It's really expensive and it requires a lot of, other things, but you might read papers and you might get interested to read and kind of think about it, and specifically you might get very intimidated by those papers, or very like, oh wow, those people, they're really, like, unlike linguists, they are really dealing with the brain and with neurons and so forth. So I just want to be very clear. So this picture you already saw. So this is the machine, and it does look very big and scary, and it really is scary. But we have to understand that we are meant. First of all, we have to understand a few things, and this is a good diagram. This is the whole processing pipeline of imaging data. So we go from the signal somewhere all the way there on the image time series. Actually, we should probably go even backward to understand, but it will require too much physics. So maybe we won't do that. But this is a good. This one. Maybe that's better. So we have this is the kind of conceptual structure behind imaging. bold imaging. Now we're talking about bold fMRI. Not there's other alternatives. Talking about the more standard, what Andrea talked about, what I have been doing. So we have a stimulus. The stimulus we assume generates increasing neural activity in the relevant regions that do some processing, and that changes that leads for reasons. And this, I haven't followed the literature in the last few years, but there's actually, at the time at least, that I was looking at these issues more closely, that was a very intriguing fact that after there was more neural activity, it generated actually a lot of fresh blood was sent to the region that was activated. A lot of fresh blood, much more than the region actually needed for oxygen or for any other explanation. Something, at least at the time, there was no good explanation why. And that created increase of oxygenated blood in the, or decrease in deoxygenated hemoglobin in the region that was active a few seconds before. And this is actually what we are measuring. So we are measuring changes in oxygen levels in the tissue that was near the neural tissue that was active. So it's not a direct measure of brain activity. It's an indirect measure by itself already. But even furthermore, the map you have, and this is really. Sometimes you see images like this, and I was like that, and that look at, oh, this is really active here. Look how yellow it is, So it's really, and this is, this is blue. This is really like maybe cold. I don't know, but those are actually no, those are not. Those are highly processed images that have gone through a lot of steps of mathematical steps of smoothing and realignment and normalization, because we are trying to combine data mostly from multiple subjects, and they don't have their brains are not the same, so you have to kind of make some assumptions of how to put them one on top of the other and so forth. And then we get a group map, and this group map is not by, usually what you see plotted are not even the level of activation, but kind of almost something like the significance level, or the size of the effect within some kind of statistics. And so this is important because this is actually taken, not my work, but this is the same map, just thresholded in 3 different levels. So then you ask, what is the true activation? There's no answer to that. There's no true activation. It's not the case. Is this activation not true because it doesn't appear here? Or is this more true than that? Those are standards, those are, those are conventions we have to assume certain thresholds, and if they're accepted, yeah.
Can I just say, is that true of all statistics?
True, yeah, of course, but. But I think that when you, I have a tendency to believe that when we see images of things, it's different when we see tables. When we see tables, we feel images kind of give us a sense of reality of some sort. That's the risk. Of course, it's not different. It's not different than any. It's just that we are. At least I would say that myself, even today, when I look at papers, I sometimes forget that I'm looking at statistical tables translated into an image rather than some real activity.
Yeah, I see the risk you're saying is that if you just plot, this is the threshold, that's it, you don't give any other information, you're risking, whereas when you give like reading time data, usually you're giving like the means and the standard deviation, so you can make better assessments.
Yeah.
So you can be deceptive with fMRI if you want to be, hopefully.
You can be deceptive, and I think the problem is that even if all the data there, the explanation is in the small prints in the method section, and the image is really big, and the image is the one that makes its way also to New York Times and so forth, and that's what you see as brain activity. And I'm just wanting to point out, I'm sorry, it's a bit of a, but I think it's important just to keep that in mind, because from now on I'll treat, I was going, oh, here, brain activity there, just remember that I don't really mean what I'm saying. Okay. Then I would, if I have time, and we might get back to this issue, probably won't have time. Let's keep that. But I want to go to some issues more directly related to things we talked about here. So these are some issues that I want to mention that are problematic with respect to how fMRI is done today. Some of them have been actually addressed directly by David and Andrea in their work, and so it's nice.
See your slides.
Oh, sorry. I'm talking to myself.
We can hear you.
Yeah. Oh, good. So you didn't see all that irrelevant stuff. So, yeah, okay. So let's just go into it. So one thing I want to talk about is the subtraction design. So subtraction design is, and David wrote a lot about it, but I must say David decided to talk a lot, which was great, about the patient work, but he's done an amazing amount of work in brain imaging as well that he did not mention. And so a lot of what I'm saying is actually, he could have come here and given his talk much better, but as he didn't, I will do it. It's true. But what happened in how we do subtraction design in fMRI, it's a very standard design, starting to change, but still very dominant. We have two conditions. David made a reference to that. There is some kind of a baseline condition where we assume that the process does not take place, and then there is the target condition where the process does. We talked today about movement, for example, or syntax or something like that, and there isn't in the other. And then you take one map, like we just saw, you take a second map of activation, you do one minus the other, and you assume that wherever you find a difference, that region, that voxel, or then region, whatever, is involved, has some kind of role in this specific activity. And that, you can imagine a very simple experiment like word generation versus word repetition. So you have these two, one in one, so it's the same words, the person either says them or just repeats them from presentation. And then you can say, okay, the articulatory part, all that is the same, because in both cases the person is producing the word, but in one case there's really, there might be more conceptual processes involved in, generating the lexical item, etc. And so if we do one minus the other, we will get the regions with not production of not the actual articulation of the word, but the more lexical entry. Even here I might have some questions, but let's just jump into syntax, into sentence processing, which I'm interested in. So here is a case like that. So this is, you can think of it as linguist as minimal pair. So Akim saw the tall man yesterday late at night, versus Maria, who loved Hans, who was good looking, kissed Johann. And I could ask you, okay, just the logic we just saw, what word generation versus word repetition, what do we have in B extra that we don't have in A? What is the one thing that once we do subtraction, we can say, okay, that's what that is. You're a linguist, if you're even just basically syntax, might have I'll make a presupposition failure, the response to my question.
Well, there are relative clauses in B, but there are a lot of other differences also.
Yeah. So those are just some of my, quick kind of thinking of some of the difference between those two sentences. So imagine someone would think that it would be a good idea to go into a scanner and compare these two sentences, and then find and do the map and find differences. And then you'll ask, okay, so the differences correspond to, and then they will say, then we can say, okay, it corresponds to maybe the difference in the syntactic structure, maybe in the number of proper names, maybe in the presence of absence of appositive modification, and so forth and so forth and so forth. Makes no sense, right, to try to compare these two sentences. To me. But people have done it. It got published, even a very major journal, gets lots of press, and not just, so maybe, okay, look, we did this comparison, and a claim that this is specifically recursion. So the regions that show difference between these two sentences, just so, interpretation, it's about recursion. Very difficult, very, 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 totally, anyway. That's not something we can understand. We cannot make these conclusions, I don't think. But this is so we have to find other ways to go around it.
Sorry, can I ask you something about this? So
it was actually in German. It was done in German, I must say. It was not English.
Oh, this is German. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but this is one pair of items that you've taken. So,
yeah. But they all had the same. They all had that structure. They were building it. This work, to be fair, was based on an earlier work by Ballman et al., which David made reference to, which was this artificial grammar work, which was very elegant because exactly it was avoiding a lot of the issues that real language brings about. But then, as Andrea was pointing out, it raises a whole lot of the questions about what is the relationship between artificial grammars and natural language. The work that we've done kind of tried to be somewhere in the middle. Does that respond?
Right. So I was just sort of wondering generally. So you always had one moment. So you had one member of the pair that had relative clauses and the other that had modification but no relative.
Yeah, always
Something like
what
that.
they wanted to always have is to have these nested dependencies in German. So the examples you don't show it well because in German it will a different word order, but those are translational equivalents that make the point. If you look at the German data, it's not otherwise. It's not that there is not those differences, but multiple differences between items. So I think this point was made before that paper was published, and I think by David in his group, and I think that's a very important work. And again, I think not enough discussed or taken into account in the literature, which is the fact. So Andrea talked about David's earlier work in the 90s, where there was this idea of object relatives, subject relatives, and how they differ, how this extraction differ. And what they kind of, what they did a bit 10 years later was to put all this in doubt and put like, and go like, was it really about just object versus subject relative, or was it about, was there something interacting? And what they did was to look at, again, the contrast is always subject extraction versus object extraction, but this time manipulating the animacy, animate, inanimate order of the two noun phrases. So you have the four, instead of being just a simple contrast, now it's a 2x2 contrast. And the critical point is, and I think I have the data, is that the so what was published and made very important, I think, in the 90s, result in the literature was that object extraction was, creating more activity in Broca's area, etc., than subject extraction. That's held, but only when there was an animacy, when it created an inanimate animate order that was non-canonical or non-congruent. So they call it the non-congruent effect. So that means that it's not that this result was not just related to whether the syntactic operation was present or absent. It actually had to do with some canonicity interpretation. I'm not sure, I don't even take it as one, I'm not sure it's straightforward, but at least it shows us that things are more complicated. So this is that, if I'm wrong, this is S over, so this is, sorry, I should be this. Okay, this is just the overall result where we find kind of what originally was found. So we found again kind of this area, let's call it Broca's area, active for this contrast, object extraction more than SO and OS is confusing to me because it's actually I forget what it stands for, but it's the object extraction versus subject extraction. You get more Broca, but then when we break it down to the ordering, we see that when there is this canonicity, so when you compare the AI, so when we look at the cases that create this violation of canonicity, we find the effect very strong. But when there is not this violation or when a canonicity is violated, actually in both cases, no effect at all, or at least no effect in the threshold, in the same threshold, and so forth. So which means that whatever activity happens here in this network or in these regions that might or not be connected is specifically sensitive to the order of canonicity. So this is a more fine. David, you want to say something about it? So this is, so what I showed you before was, for the richest group was this very like, wow, this is, of course there's so many things interacting. Here we're looking at a case that, that became like, the whole, so important for the literature, both in aphasia and in fMRI, on this kind of extractions, and we find out that it's not because you give object relative and subject relative that what you get as the difference is necessarily the fact of the kind of movement. It's more complicated. So there are alternatives to that, and I'll mention two of them. Actually, here I could have also put Andrea's work with Grodzinski on syntactic priming. So syntactic priming is an interesting way to look differently at fMRI data, or kind of probe differently how which regions of the brain do what, etc. And this is it's called priming or adaptation. It's kind of similar. It's the same logic. You are presenting the same thing multiple times, or something you think is not the same, and you find out whether it's adaptation or not. Adaptation means that the bold signal will go down after you present the same thing multiple times. So basically, if I tell you blue, 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 after a while, the blue area in the brain will start being less active. But if I say blue, 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 black, it will be active again, right? So it's kind of priming idea. So Christophe Ballier and in his group, they did that they tried to do that on sentences, trying to do it either repetition, so you repeat the same sentence multiple times, you repeat the same propositional content, but with different syntactic structures, or the same structure with different propositional content. That was the idea, and they wanted to know, are different regions of the brain, and which ones do habituate or adapt for those different, whether it's total repetition, the same semantics are repeated, or the same syntax is repeated. And the surprising results for them was that they got repetition habituation, they got same propositional content habituation, but no same structure habituation. So they were not able to get, so the same syntactic structure was not producing, if you repeat the same syntactic structure, changing the words, changing the meaning, and the lexical meaning, you're not getting priming. So there's a lot, it can raise a lot of questions. It has raised a lot of questions that many groups, this paper and others similar, a lot of groups have been talking about what's going on. I'll just mention one issue of worry about this translation is to what extent we really think that when I say for them the same syntactic structure are two transitive sentences. But the question I ask as a linguist, we can ask, and it's funny that Luigi Rizzi was part of this paper because he's done fundamental work to show that different transitives, that for example, the psych verbs have a different syntactic structure than active verbs, so forth. And they mix those. So everything that was just of the form NP, verb NP, was considered a transitive sentence, and the question we can ask, to what extent as linguists we want to know, are those the same things or not? So this is just one worry. It might be that there's deeper reasons why there's no syntactic priming, we can talk about it later, but it's just and again, the linguistic naivety sometimes of the papers, of papers, and this is a very interesting article done with people, experiment done with people who are very sensitive to linguistic structure, I would think, and still we find this issue of, I call linguistic naivety, that is problematic because might actually undermine our interpretation. So this is a different alternative approach. This is work I've done with Christophe Ballier during a while ago now, but will get published eventually, I think. So the interesting thing about this work, I think, is not the result, but two features, I think, of the design. So the first one is that we used multivariate analysis. So instead of looking at differences within single voxels, we looked at differences or trying to classify to see whether two different structures differ in an overall pattern in brain activity. That's interesting because sometimes we don't necessarily have assumptions that one structure has more or less activity than other. We're just interested to what extent the brain distinguishes between them, and you'll see in a moment the cases are interesting. And the second issue, we try to find a way to be in between, and this is to the point of David and Andreas before, in between artificial grammars and natural language. So to be somewhere in the middle, in a place that will allow us to benefit from both. So what we chose was, I go kind of quick, was the syntax of coordination. So let me go directly, this is a lot of blah blah, let's go. So those are so what we did, we actually created, using coordination of 4 noun phrases, we created, by just changing the, simplifying a little bit, by just changing the intonation pattern of those, how we say those 4 coordinated, I have sound, I'm not sure you will hear it from here. If it works. No. Wait, start again, sorry. Went too fast. So by just changing the intonation pattern, we you don't hear anything, right? So I don't know. So there's no sound here, right? For this. Yeah. So.
If you could just aim the mic at your computer, that would be better.
I tried.
Is your sound on?
Yeah, but it's very low. It doesn't catch it. My old computer. So it'd be something like I will try to do it myself using just A, B, C, and D. We had actually lexical items about something on the left, so a right branching structure could be something like A and B and C and D. And then you can have something like a left, let's call it a complex left branch, A and B and C and D. And something like a complex middle branch, A and B and C and D. And then you can play also on prosody level, so you can actually have things, you can actually have the same, this is taking some certain assumption that that's an important point about what is the right syntactic structure of coordination. But you can actually distinguish, for example, between A and B and C and D, which is this structure, to one more embedded, which would be something like A and B and C and D. So that would be something where you're separating A further from B and C and D, so you're creating a second embedded. So that allowed us to create two manipulations, one of syntactic structure and one of prosodic structure. So we can, again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this work. What's interesting about this work is that we allows us, if you believe to our analysis based on Michael Wagner's work about what is the correct analysis of four constituent coordination, then it allows us to vary syntactic structure, looking at some of the structure that has been discussed in auto literature, with very little issues that have to do with verb, integration, working memory, and so all these kind of things that all kind of could, canonicity and other things that can interact, because we always have the four lexical items. It always comes up to a noun phrase. I mean, it's very, very minimal manipulation. However, we would claim, even though some of our reviewers did not think, that this is still natural language. I mean, we think that coordination is natural language, and so this is natural language, the task. So this is just the two ideas I want to talk. We did a classification analysis, and we found out, this is one here, the people were looking, so the task was people were looking, and they had to do kind of a truth judgment task on those sequences. And then we classified, and we found out it, and let's just go quickly to the result again. A lot of time, just to show you one way of looking at the results. So these are the results of classifying the different syntactic structures. Remember, we had 3 syntactic structures, but each of them had 2 different manifestations according to our theory. So this was so we had overall 6 structures. So those are the contrasts that we hypothesized were real. So the difference between, right branching and left branching, or between left branching and middle branching, or between right branching and middle branching. So those are those combinations, and we see that our classifier does significantly better than chance at distinguishing them, but more importantly, it does it better than any other combination of 2 trees. So it's not just that it can classify any combination of 2 trees, 2 kinds of sequences, or not 2 trees, 2 kinds of prosodic sequences. It's particularly the kinds that we hypothesize were actually derived from the same syntactic structure, embedded syntactic structure. I know it's a bit fast, but the point I want to make about this paper is less the results and more the points about how to think of possible experiments using, I think, this kind of fragments of language which are simplified but still have properties which we are interested in.